welcome back for another Giant Slayer TFT Top 10 video. Today's video will be a countdown of the top champions for ranked play in patch 10.24. The meta has had a wide variety of viable champions thanks to shop changes, but the top champions have shifted a bit after the recent hotfixes. But at least we're finally in a meta where Talon isn't the best champion, so all of these changes are quite welcome. With all that said, let's go ahead and dive on in. But before we begin, please don't forget to click the links in our description. Give your support to everyone who helped make this video happen. We host many TFT tournaments with plenty of exciting content to come, so be sure to also follow our Giant Slayer TFT social media pages. Alright, let's get back to the video. To start our list today, we have Kindred coming in as the number 10 champion. Honestly, the 10th spot on this list could be open for a lot of contenders since this meta can be quite diverse, depending on whether you're wanting to play flexible or not. But Kindred takes the spot as they really embody the changes introduced in 10.24 that altered shop changes, player damage, and chosen drop rates. Basically, having a flexible 3-cost champion makes transitioning towards late game compositions much easier, and Kindred is one of the best standalone champions for that. In addition to that, since they are Hunter, they pair well with other meta champions like Warwick and Ashe. Spirit may not matter as much right now, but a mid-game combination of Kindred and Yuumi is pretty darn good. All in all, the meta still heavily favors late-game champions, but to get there, you do need a good foundation to build from, and Kindred can provide that. Moving along, we've got another low-cost champion, with Jarvan coming in as the number 9 slot. Jarvan has really done a number on the early game with the buffs that he's received, whether he's being played by himself, with another keeper, or warlords. He can deal a lot of damage if you can 2-star him, and with the smaller mana pool, he's likely to get several casts off of his ability during a fight. Jarvan is easily one of the best units that you can have in the early game because of that. While they did nerf keepers slightly, they're still quite good early on in the game, so if you can find, say, an Elise and a Jarvan, you have a ridiculously strong starting board. This also means Jarvan is a great addition to an early and mid-game cultist board since he provides a good amount of CC, damage, and of course, the shields from Keeper. As for his other trait, Warlords, it can be hit or miss currently, but an early enough Jarvan too, especially as a Chosen, can make them do well enough until you transition out of them late game. Overall, as far as 2-cost champions go, you can almost always toss in Jarvan until the late game, whether you're using his traits or not. Our next champions share a common trait, but are used quite different after the hotfix changes. Up first is the number 8 champion, Shen. Shen is still highly contested in the meta, although it's for different reasons after the hotfix change. Prior to the hotfix to Zed, it was all about Zed and ninjas, and even though Adept is still really good, Shen was primarily contested due to being a ninja. But after the tweaks they did to Zed, it seems Warwick with Divine has taken up the mantle as top dog, and that means you'll be wanting to pair Shen with Aurelia for Adept. Plus, in the late game, Yone is still quite good, so having Shen, Aurelia, or both is really a good idea. As for Shen, he's just an all-around solid champion. He's able to survive in the front line, does okay damage with the ninja tag, and gives access to the 2 best splash traits in the game, Adept and Mystic. The major downside to Shen is that 2-starring a 4-cost unit can be difficult prior to level 8, especially one that's as contested as he is. But if you find Shen, you'll be in a good spot as he fits into a multitude of comps. The second ninja on the list, coming in at number 7, is Zed. It's difficult to say exactly where Zed should end up on the top 10. We're being safe in placing him towards the back end of the list because the meta has shifted quite drastically after the hotfix. Zed does still seem to be viable. In fact, he's likely nearly as strong as he was prior to the hotfix if you can 3-star him, but the fact that you need to 3-star him makes him much less consistent. Prior to the hotfix, you could get away with a regular old Zed 2 with good items, but that doesn't really seem to be the case anymore. You'll need a chosen Zed, perfect items, and eventually have to 3-star him. While that path is definitely viable and strong, it does make playing him a lot harder and far less consistent. Another thing to consider is that with Warwick and Divine being popular, it means Shen is heavily contested, and without Shen, you're not able to hit 4 ninja, which is the main way to play Zed currently. Of course, it's not all doom and gloom for Zed, as he's still going to provide a huge power spike if you can find a chosen Zed early on in the game, and in the right conditions, you'll still do well in the late game. So despite the meta moving away from Zed Ninja, it's still a perfectly viable path to take if you're presented with the option. Let's move on to the next champion that comes in at number 6, Riven. Yep, Dusk is still good. And the champion that we all think of when we hear Dusk is Riven. Sure, a lot of the other Dusk champions are strong, but Riven is the backbone, the foundation that you need to build a Dusk composition around. Of course, you can always just splash in 2 Dusk for the bonus spell power, but if you want to commit to Dusk, yeah, you need Riven. And for good reason, since she's both hard to kill and does a lot of damage. But she can struggle against champions that dish out a lot of damage like Jhin or Warwick, so be careful how you position her against players running those champs. Otherwise, she's free to do as she pleases in the front line as long as you give her decent defensive items. Alongside Dusk, keep her still an okay trait to play during the mid game if you happen to roll Riven early on. It's not going to do quite as well into the late game, but during the mid game you do get a lot of value from playing it with a Riven. At the end of the day though, it's going to be Dusk that you aim for when playing Riven. 6 Dusk is going to be preferred, but you can be good enough with just 4 since it allows for a really flexible board. Overall, Riven isn't the strongest carry in the game, but she's one of the most reliable and consistent thanks to being a Dusk champion. Next, we have Zilean as the number 5 champion for today's list. Normally, we'd have one Mystic in our top 10, but Zilean really needs to be acknowledged, as does Shen. It's no secret that legendary champions are doing quite well in the meta. In fact, they're the cornerstone to a strong late game. While there's a ton of choices, the best utility you're going to find is in Zilean, thanks to his ultimate and the fact that he's a Mystic. Zilean is also great for cultists if you can find him early enough in the game, which generally means high rolling him at level 7. But even at level 8, you can still find use for him for, say, 9 cultists, and you can transition your board to level 9. Cultists definitely took a hit after the hotfix, but they're still one of the best early and mid-game synergies that you can play, so having Zilean as an option for them is quite good. Unfortunately, it can be difficult to find him in time, so don't always expect to hit a Zilean if you're running cultists. Mystic, on the other hand, always has value, even in a meta that's starting to favor physical damage because of Warwick. And Zilean provides even more value because of his ability that revives units. So really, there's no better champion you can add into your composition late game if you're looking for strong utility and to splash in Mystic. Moving along, we have Jhin coming in as the number 4 champion. Jhin has really solidified himself as a reliable backline carry after they buffed his attack damage from 85 up to 100. Of course, he was a great carry prior to that, but the base damage increase has really upped his value by a large amount. The downside for Jhin is that Sharpshooters, at least as a full comp, isn't doing as well, so you're likely to see that specific build not really played as much as it once was. On the plus side, Jhin doesn't really need 6 Sharpshooters to do well. Just 2 does the trick for him, or none if you'd rather just run him as a solo backline damage dealer. But he shines the brightest with cultists, at least in the mid game, if you can 2-star him. Regardless of how you play him, the fact remains that Jhin has some of the highest physical damage in the game and makes him a valuable asset to play for a lot of different comps. We're now into our top 3 with the champion coming in at number 3, Kayn. Kayn has returned as a formidable late game champion in the meta as his late game damage is ridiculously good. While he was part of the Zed comp prior to the hotfix, he really wasn't reliant on that to be viable since Shade isn't that important of a trait for him. So with Zed falling slightly in viability, Kayn remains exactly where he was prior to it as one of the best 5-cost champions in the game. As to why he's so good, well, it's all about the damage he puts out. Being able to isolate and kill a target is great, but he also just does a ton of AoE if he gets in the middle of a bunch of enemy champions. In addition to that, both of his upgrades can be valuable, though increased damage tends to be better to add more AoE to his damage. One of the best things about Kayn, and a lot of legendaries, is you don't need perfect items for them to do well. Slap some ability power items on him, maybe a defensive one, and you're good to go. The only downside to a 5-cost champion like Kayn is being able to 2-star him. But if you can find an early Kayn or 2-star him late game, chances are you're going to be in a good position to get at least a top 4. Another top legendary champion is Yone, who comes in at number 2 on our list. It's debatable whether or not Yone and Kayn should be swapped, as Yone did receive a nerf in the hotfix patch. The reason as to why Yone gets the spot is mainly because Adept is such a good synergy, especially now with Divine being the best comp. So while Kayn is generally played by himself without really considering his traits, you can throw in Yone and get even more value because splashing in 2 Adepts is quite easy. Yone also does a good amount of damage even though his armor and magic resist shred was reduced from 90% to 60%. A 60% reduction is still enough to burn through the majority of squishy champions and nearly one-shot them, so while the nerf is definitely noticeable, it really doesn't end up being too big of a deal. The bottom line is Yone is one of the best late game champions to splash into any composition for both his damage, survivability, and being adept. And the number 1 champion on our list for today is Warwick. A few days ago, this would have been a surprise, but after the hotfix came in, Warwick really swooped in and took the meta by storm with Divine. Honestly, it may have happened even without the hotfix changes, as players were still in the process of figuring out Warwick after the initial changes in 1024. Losing the CC on his ultimate seems like it would hurt him a lot, but the attack speed buff he provides to any champion that shares his traits is just ridiculously good. Enough so that other Divine champions get a huge damage spike during the duration of Divine, as he'll be dishing out a ton of true damage. And Warwick himself scales quite well with attack speed, plus items like Ruin's Hurricane and Deathblade. While we're not quite at Warweek levels of ridiculous, it's definitely clear that Warwick deserves the spot as the number 1 champion for the second half of patch 1024. And that's going to be it for our top 10 champions. But before we go, we have one honorable mention to talk about. The honorable mention for this patch is legendaries. Basically, 5-cost champions are hugely important to the current late game meta. While I've talked about a few of them in the top 10, we want to make it clear that all of the 5-cost champions have a place in the late game, as 2-starring them is a huge power spike. If you're wondering how best to transition your late game board and are having difficulties with it, we recommend just playing a few 5-cost champions and trying to 2-star them. Believe us, it will make a huge difference. Alright folks, that's all we've got for you for today. Warwick is back, but at least it's not just him at the top of the meta, as we're in a really healthy place after the large number of changes added with 1024. Let us know in the comment section below what champions you think deserve to be on the list that we may have missed. Thank you for watching, and if you're enjoying our content, be sure to hit the like button and subscribe for future Giant Slayer TFT videos.